Good evening and welcome to Understanding Islamophobia, an event that we're hosting with Dr. Amer Ahmed. And I would like to do a few things before we get started. First of all, thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us and learn about this topic. The second is, I should introduce myself, is Mark Kamimura Jimenez. He, him, his pronouns. I am the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Dean of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion here at Washington University in St. Louis. And uh, I'd also like to start by providing an acknowledgement of this land that we're located on as the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Oto Missouri Nation, and Illini Confederacy. And also acknowledge that we've all benefited and continue to gain from this land that is occupied by us. I'd also like to thank our Indigenous ancestors for giving us the earth and the tools to understand life and our responsibility to maintain it. In addition, we'd like to really thank Provost Beverly Wendland, Vice Provost Kia Caldwell, and Assistant Vice Chancellor Nicole Hudson of the Academy for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Dr. Anna Gonzalez, for their partnership and support of this event. In addition, I'd also like to thank Dr. Ariel Williams and the staff of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion for your work to make this event happen. We're here because we have a need in our community to understand Islamophobia, and the work that Dr. Ahmed has done on this will provide us a backdrop for this understanding. And I'd like to introduce him in our way, which is just to let you know that we go back quite a few years, actually almost 10 years now, in our partnership and work on diversity on a college campus not far from here, but far from where he's at right now. And that in that work, we were in a meeting one day, and we always served food at these meetings back in the day before we were in this virtual environment. And while we're eating, we're talking about tacos, and there's this taco place down the street in Ann Arbor, and Amer's like, "Have you gone to this place?" I'm like, "No." He's like, "Yeah, you need to go check this place out." And I was like, "Oh, where is it?" And he's like, "Oh, it's just down the street from my house." And he starts naming the street, and I'm like, "Well, I live close to that street too." And he's like, "Oh no, I actually live on this street." I'm like, "Oh, I live on that street too." And and I said, "Well, what's your address?" We're like one address. We go home that night, and we're parked across the street from each other. And it just, in that moment, Amer has been a national speaker and one whose expertise has been leaned on by universities and organizations across the country and globally as well. And so he was doing a lot more traveling at the time, and our paths just had not crossed. And my boys and my family's time was pulling us to athletic events. Just our paths had not crossed at that moment. And it was awesome to have that opportunity to get to know Amer and the work and his dedication to our communities, and also to understand the impact that he has made in higher education. I think that oftentimes we don't know who our neighbors are, and that in that moment, I was reminded immediately how important it is to understand who you live next to, who you talk to, and who you become friends with. As many of our students will quickly learn over their time on college campuses, that their neighbors also are important stories to learn and to understand. Dr. Ahmed now, as we get to refer to him as, has been an extraordinary leader in intercultural diversity and a consultant to many folks on how to think to the depths of understanding about what equity and inclusion work really means and the dedication it takes to sustain it and make transformational change on a campus, but also has worked with nonprofit groups, schools, community groups, and also coached up many folks in the field to who have dealt with different moments of critical crises, either in their campus or in their organization, and has been a person that is on many people's well, we used to say Rolodex back in the day, but he's on many people's favorite. He's starred up in their contacts because he's the person that you need to call. He's keynoted at national organizations and conferences, and we're really lucky to have him here tonight to share with us his work. I should also mention that he has recently been named and currently holds the position of Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and is on the faculty in the Higher Ed and Student Affairs Administration program at the University of Vermont. And so with that, I'm excited to welcome my brother, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, my brother, Dr. Kamimura Jimenez. It's wonderful to hear that story. The other dimension to why I hadn't seen you is because I was a full-time professional at University of Michigan and a full-time doctoral student at the time. And I had the blinders on, as many of us who've gone down that path have experienced. And I appreciate you sharing that lesson because it was a lesson that I learned. And I'm so thankful to be in fellowship and family and friendship with your family. So thank you all for having me. I do want to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Abenaki people, and I want to acknowledge their stewardship of this land and the occupation of this land here in Northern Vermont. And I want to acknowledge the Native people in each of the 4 directions in relationship to me. Also want to have gratitude for all the labor that I and all of us benefit from that allows us to have access to clean water and food and electricity, the internet that allows us to engage in this space today. Gratitude to all that labor that we oftentimes call essential work now, that we recognize we are completely interdependent upon. And also all the people at WashU, including my brother, Dr. Kamimura, thank you very much. So I'm here to engage with you shortly after the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the topic of addressing Islamophobia. And as a person who has been engaging this topic for a number of years, I have continued to find that there is a need for further education about my community, the American Muslim community, to provide historical context, and also to learn more about the issues related to Islamophobia as a social, historical, political phenomenon as well. And so that's what I'll seek to do today. But I'll start with some basic information. Many of you may be familiar with the religion of Islam, and I'm not a religious scholar, and I don't claim to be, and so I want to be really clear that there's many understandings of the religion of Islam, and I'm not a sole authority on that. However, there are some basic shared understandings that are mostly, for the most part, shared by the 1.8 billion Muslims on this planet. And really the core of that are what we refer to as the 5 pillars of Islam. And first and foremost is a faith and declaration in the oneness of Allah, Allah simply being the Arabic word for God, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, as his prophet. This is known as the Shahada, or the declaration of faith. To be a Muslim, all it takes is to be able to declare this through your own free will and belief. And that's it. Everything else after this is about living into that belief, which is what the rest of the pillars are about. So if you know practicing Muslims, daily prayer is part of daily life. There's 5 prescribed times of daily prayer. You may be familiar with the month of Ramadan, the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, which is about 10 to 11 days shorter than the Western solar calendar. So it gets a little earlier each year. So this academic year, towards the end of the academic year, will fall during Ramadan this year, which means that it's important for Muslim students to be accommodated for their needs of being able to eat, at times that are appropriate for them to be able to fulfill this obligation, in which we abstain from eating and drinking from sunrise to sunset each day throughout that month, which is a time of prayer, a time of reflection. It's a time of being in gratitude, again, for the fact that we're not guaranteed easy access to food and water. That's something provided to us and what we believe is our creator. And so so it is a time of deep reflection, an important time of year for our faith tradition. Another pillar is known as zakat, or charity. So Muslims are required to give a percentage of their wealth away each year. And this speaks to the fact that your individual faith is not enough. You have a social responsibility to your fellow human being for their well-being. And this is also a way of creating a social safety net in a given society as well. And then if you're physically and economically able to do so, a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in your life, which I've been fortunate enough to have done. And what you'll find is, hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of people converging in modern day Saudi Arabia. And you'll see people from all over the planet, and they're all wearing a white cloth. And what that symbolizes, as we complete these rites of passage over the course of 4 days, is that that no matter how wealthy or how poor you are, that you are all equal in the eyes of the Creator. And so a lot of our faith tradition is about egalitarianism, around equality, around the idea that every human being has equal intrinsic value in the eyes of our Creator. And that's embedded into our rituals, into our prayer, into our pilgrimage, and so forth. And so this is a deeply held belief in our tradition. And we consider ourselves to be an Abrahamic faith. So Jesus is considered to be the second to last prophet in the Islamic tradition that's mentioned in our Holy Scripture known as the Quran, which is believed to have been revealed through the Prophet Muhammad. Moses, Noah, Isaac, Ishmael, these are all prophets in the Islamic tradition. And so those who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition would be familiar with many of the stories and many of the messages of our Holy Scripture. There's many overlaps. And then a basic concept about the religion is that your works matter, that there's a belief in a day of judgment, there's a belief in heaven and hell. So those who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition would be very familiar with a lot of these concepts, right? The reason why it's important to point this out is because a lot of times Islam is portrayed as this very foreign and other religion that is so and oftentimes demonized and almost kind of framed as this, and we'll get at some of the myths right now, but so it's really important to establish what are the core fundamental beliefs and that are attracting people to the tradition, and what causes them, and what the beliefs are, and what really is at the center of that tradition for most people on the planet. And so, as I mentioned, there are some misunderstandings. There's about the tradition, especially in Western civilization, especially in the United States. And so at this point, it's really important to make a distinction between what a religion teaches and what people do, right? People do all different kinds of things in the name of religion, but then there's just what a religion actually teaches, right? And so I'm not here to defend anybody's, every single person out there that does whatever they do. Like I can't control that. But what I can do is share with you some things about the tradition that maybe you may be unfamiliar with. And so to give you an example of that is some things around women's rights. And I'm not a woman, and I don't identify as a woman, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Muslim women, but what I'm going to share with you are some rights that were guaranteed to women in the Islamic tradition over 1,400 years ago that only came into Western civilization in the last 100 years. So the first Islamic civilizations, women had the right to vote, which was a radical concept in the Arabian Peninsula at that time, and certainly throughout the world, really. And then also a lot of rights were guaranteed through marriage. And so a marriage in the Islamic tradition is called a nikah. It's a legal agreement. There's a contract, and it's supposed to be two equal parties coming into a legal agreement through their own free will. And at the time of marriage, a lot of traditions have what's known as dowry. You may be familiar with dowry. In most cultures, dowry is a set of wealth that is passed from the woman or the woman's family to the man or the man's family. In the Islamic tradition, it's the exact opposite. It's a set of wealth from the man or the man's family to the woman. not the woman's family, to the woman. And what that does is that it establishes personal property rights for women. That person does not have to share those resources with anybody. It's a form of protection for many reasons. Should that person be widowed? Should that person should there be divorce, which is another right in the Islamic tradition that's not guaranteed in every other tradition. They don't have to share with their children. They can start a business with it, and so forth. And so when we see different people undermining women's rights in the name of Islam, we know that they're in conflict with very basic foundational concepts and realities in the actual tradition, right? And then another important element of this is that a lot of times in our tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is revered as his model of example of, and the Prophet's wife, Khadijah, was the wealthiest woman in all of Mecca. She was his boss. She ran a trade business, and she was the first woman to convert to Islam. And so this powerful example of a powerful woman and a businesswoman, this is the model that we have, but yet we see people in different places operating and undermining the ability for women to be able to enact and live the way in which Khadijah did. And so in some ways, we see this conflict between these examples and these rights that are guaranteed and what people do really more in the name of patriarchy than anything else. Another myth is the perception of violence, that Islam is a violent religion. There's a perception that it compels people to violence. And now our response as Muslims is that we say, well, no, Islam means peace by definition. It means peace through the submission to God. That's what it translates to English. And so, and if you look at those 5 pillars and the foundations of the religion, there's nothing about violence there, right? But many people say, yeah, but what about this concept of jihad, right? And so in Western media, we hear jihad, we're told that it means holy war. Jihad does not mean holy war. Jihad in English translates to struggle. And now there's 2 types of jihad. There's a greater jihad and a lesser jihad. The greater jihad is a spiritual struggle to navigate the moral and ethical dilemmas of daily life, to try to be God conscious in your choices and to be able to make good decisions, right? The lesser jihad is a more physical interpretation of the term. And in that interpretation, the idea is that when one is under attack, you have the right to defend yourself, your family, and your community. Right? So Islam is not a pacifist religion. And the idea is that if you are attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. So now I want you to think about our laws here in the United States that are rooted in Judeo-Christian law, right? Is the penalty for murder and self-defense the same as premeditated murder? No, it's the exact same concept, right? And so what overwhelmingly scholars all over the world agree upon is that what cannot be justified under jihad are violence, unprovoked violence, especially against non-combatants. That is not justifiable under the concept of jihad by overwhelmingly the vast majority of scholars around the world. There's also a perception that Islam is anti-Semitic. And when I say this, a negative attitude towards Jewish people, even though there's non-Jewish Semitic people, so it's not a perfect term, but we'll leave it at that. That's the term that is used in the US. So there's a lot of times there's a conflation of the conflict of Israel and Palestine and the conflating of that with the ideas as related to the relationships between Muslims and Jews. And that is not a conflict between inherently Muslims and Jews. It is a conflict between a nation state with laws, policies, and practices and the people of that region. Which connects to our next myth, the idea that Muslim equals Arab and Arab equals Muslim. So 20% of Palestinian people are Christian, half of Lebanese people are Christian. So the conflict of Israel-Palestine involves many people that are not all Muslim, and only about the opposite is also not true. Obviously, not all Muslims are Arab. Only 18 to 20% of all the Muslims on the planet are Arab. The largest Muslim population is in Indonesia. The second largest populations are India and Pakistan. Each kind of second and third are very close. So the large population of Muslims in South Asia. And so again, sometimes we hear the term Arab and Muslim used interchangeably as if they're the same thing. They're not. And it's important we understand the difference. There's an overlap, but it's not the same. And then lastly, there's a perception that Islam is that Islam is anti-American, that you really can't be a practicing Muslim and reconcile American values. And this is really challenging for those of us who identify as American Muslims. I mentioned to you that we have a very egalitarian tradition. We believe that we're all equals in the eyes of our Creator. And you could say we don't live up to that all the time, and because we're human beings and we're imperfect. But if you think about that as related to American democratic values, right? The idea that we're all equal in a society, that we all have an equal voice. You could say we don't always live up to that either. But the principle is there. And so for most American Muslims that I've ever met in my life, those principles actually go together quite nicely, right? But oftentimes as Muslims, we're framed as at odds with being American on the outside, we're foreign and we're other, we're not really truly American. And it's a widely held sentiment. The Public Research Institute a few years ago had a poll and asked, is Islam at odds with American values? And more than 56% of people responded as yes. And so it is not a small proportion of Americans that have these sentiments or anxieties or concerns or questions or perceptions that we as Muslims are somehow in conflict with American values. And so I think it's important when we talk about religion. I told you there's many ways in which Islam shows up in the world. Well, part of the reason why is because there's a relationship between religion and culture and how it functions and operates in our world. And so, as a Muslim, we view ourselves as having a global identity, a global community. We call ourselves an ummah, a global community of brothers and sisters. We refer to each other as brothers and sisters. If you go different places in the world, you'll see that Islam looks very different in different cultures and societies. And that impacts the interpretation of the tradition. So let me give you an example. My family is from India originally. And, a lot of our traditions are influenced by Hinduism, and including our weddings. And so in the Indian wedding, some of you may have been to an Indian wedding, and you'll find that the tradition is like, and again, I know all the examples I'm using are very heteronormative, but these are the examples of our traditions, unfortunately, that we have to draw from. So in our weddings, it's the tradition is like the woman going into the man's family. It's like she's supposed to look sad, and she's going off into this other family, and she's leaving this one family. That's like the tradition. And so they take the name of the new family that they're marrying into, and so forth and so on. Now, a lot of my Muslim friends are Black American, white American converts. And I had a friend, and she was married to another one of my friends, and she had a different last name from her spouse. And, I said, why did you choose to keep your last name? And she's like, well, that's the Islamic tradition. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's the woman going into the man's family. And she's like, no, that's your culture. She's like, the Islamic tradition is two equal parties coming into a legal agreement, not one person going into the other family. And so for me, I was at that time 26 years old, and I'd never heard anyone say that before. Because for me, I was taught my religion and my culture together. So sometimes it wasn't always clear what are the things that I was being taught that was my religion versus what are the things that were my culture, right? And so it becomes kind of blurry for a lot of people. And so again, it starts to show up in all different kinds of ways in people's lives. And so I have 3 photos from different parts of the world. So the top right image is of a mosque in China. And I've actually been to that mosque. And if you go in, it's like a Chinese temple courtyard, and you'll see Arabic calligraphy in the shape of a dragon. And so that's the way the culture is being integrated into the tradition. And so when I went in to pray, the prayers in Arabic, like in most places in the world, and I understood everything that was going on. I felt the connection spiritually to everybody I was praying with. And then afterwards, we couldn't speak one word to each other. And so it speaks to how the tradition creates this connection, but all this, we're also different in so many other ways. And so there's all this variation. And you see this in the architecture and the dress and the clothing, and that you see in the bottom right example in Timbuktu in Mali in West Africa, which used to be one of the intellectual centers of the world. And then the bottom left is Mecca, the holy center of the Islamic world. The black building at the center is believed to have been built by Abraham. It's known as the Kaaba. That's the building towards which Muslims all around the world are praying in the direction of, which is why that's the one mosque you'll see in the world that where Muslims are praying in a circle as opposed to standing in a straight line and facing the direction of Mecca. And so again, all this diversity that exists across the world of all these different kinds of people. And as I've alluded to, there's a lot of connections between Islam and Christianity specifically. And the reality is that most Muslims are much more aware of the relationship between Islam and Christianity than vice versa, because we're taught Islam in relationship to Christianity. And so there's a lot of similarities, as I mentioned, but there are some differences from most forms of post-Constantinian Christianity. So there's no concept of the Trinity. That's the main difference in the conception. And then some forms of Christianity have kind of this idea of missionizing, spreading the good news. That is not a concept in the Islamic tradition. So as you look around the world, you won't see much missionary work. Or instead, there's a concept known as dawah, which is more to set an example. And so the idea is to set an example, and that others will be through their own free will choose to be part of a tradition. And so there's a phrase in our Holy Scripture, the Quran, that says there's no compulsion in religion, that no one should be forced to believe something that they don't believe. And so this is part of why we know that some extremists in the world who try to force people to be Muslim, we know that is completely in conflict with what our tradition teaches. So it's important to be able to understand why the world is the way that it is. It's really important to get historical context. And a lot of Americans, we don't always learn the historical context we need to be able to process and understand why things in the world are the way that they are. And another thing that's important to know is that most people are much more aware of the history of their own lands than other people are from other places, right? And so the history that I'm going to overview right now is there's a broad awareness of this in many parts of the world, but may not be the case in the United States by most people. And so first of all, everybody should read Orientalism by Edward Said at some point in their life, which was about the distorted lens of exotification and superiority that Europeans had towards Eastern cultures, particularly Arab cultures. And that is part of what sparked the Crusades. In the bottom left, you see various waves of the Crusades in which Jews and Muslims were slaughtered time and time again. But what's less talked about is the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain. In the bottom right, you see a map of Moorish Spain, which was ruled by African and Arab Muslims for 700 years. It was the most advanced civilization in the history of the world at the time, advances in mathematics, science, pluralistic, inclusive of Christians, Jews, and other groups. And what you'll see over time is a diminishing of that territory because various popes declared the Moors as dark-skinned savages that needed to be ridded from Europe. And the Roman Church and other aspects, power centers in Europe, viewed the Moors' presence in Europe as a threat. And so there was a lot of propaganda. And then over time, they started to push the Moors out. That process was completed in 1492, the spring of 1492. What happened later that year? Christopher Columbus sent off to the quote unquote New World by Isabella. Now, when Columbus and the various conquistadors came to the Americas and saw the indigenous people, what did they call them? They called them savages. The concept of the dark-skinned subhuman savage was cultivated in the process of taking back Spain. And then that launched an era of colonialism in which Europeans went all over the world and conquered lands, exploited resources, extracted resources, exploited, transported labor and exploited labor in horrific ways all over the planet. terrorized indigenous people. We know that story, but what we oftentimes don't understand as well is what happened in the post-colonial era, in which Europeans started to realize people don't really like to be ruled by them. And so instead, what they started to do is to strategically divide up ethnic groups, pit them against one another, force them to share different lands, elevate certain groups over others, and oftentimes appoint a dictator that would be favorable to them to allow them to continue to extract resources out of the country. And so after World War II, when Europe was decimated from war, the US essentially inherited that colonial history. We emerged as a superpower and embarked in an era of neo-colonialism in which we overthrew democratically elected government, dictators all over the world. So Alfred McCoy said the US empire coincided with the decolonization and dissolution of half a dozen European empires, produced 100 new nations, more than half the independent nations on the planet today. And so US hegemony was being exercised not over colonies, sovereignty was compromised, in fact, had been transferred to the imperial power, but over independent nation states who had sovereignty. So you had an empire under conditions that denied empire. So how do you exercise hegemony in a non-hegemonic world? You have to do it covertly. And so our CIA very much was involved in overthrowing democratically elected governments in various places in the world, in places like Iran in the 1950s, and then we installed someone known as the Shah in Iran. In Egypt, we supported, for 30 years, we supported Hosni Mubarak, who was a dictator of Egypt. So there's many countries in which we engaged in these kinds of policies. And if you look at the where the majority of Muslims on the planet live, you know, you look at this map and you kind of say like, okay, yeah, that's like the way the map looks generally. That's kind of how we've been taught it. But if you looked at a map just over 100 years ago, it would have looked very different. And it really, you can understand where Muslims live in the world as related to the history of trade and during Islamic civilizations. And so after the first 200 years, primarily Islam spread through trade. And so in Central Asia, there was a silk route to China. And so you had silk and paper come west to Mecca, which was the trade center of the world. And then that paper went across to trans-Saharan trade routes to West Africa. That's how paper and the written tradition got to West Africa. Gold from West Africa went east and devalued gold worldwide. You had the Indian spice trade of the Indian Ocean. And so you had all this cross-pollination and exchange and trade and exchanging of ideas, stories, spirituality. And so that's kind of can help you explain kind of where Muslims live and why. But then with the colonial process, see, because, you know, under Islamic civilizations, they were like federations. They had weak central governments and strong local control, including self-determination for minorities like Jews and so forth. And so what you ended up having was this freedom of movement. People could exchange goods across distant lands. But as we get into the post-colonial era and the creation of the nation state, which is really a phenomenon of the 20th century that emerged, you suddenly needed permission to cross borders. So there was no such thing as a passport before, but now you need permission, right? And so if you look at the map through the lens of colonialism, you start to understand why the map looks like it. So let's just take Afghanistan, because it's certainly been on many people's minds lately. Again, we just completed the longest war in the United States history, but by most perceptions, a failed war for the most part. Every ethnic group of Afghanistan is split across two countries. That was by design. It was created by the British as a buffer state for their crown jewel, India, which they didn't want to share a border with China, which had not yet invaded Tibet at the time. And so if you look in Afghanistan, you see that tiny little strip of land that sticks out in the northeast. That's there because they didn't want China to share a border with India. And so if you live in that little tiny strip of land, you have to travel 2 weeks to Kabul to sell your goats or whatever. You can't just cross those borders, right? And so again, it wasn't about creating a country that was cohesive and that for the people were destined to share, but no, it was about an outside foreign interest as related to that place. You may know about Iraq. Iraq as many people know, there's a Sunni Arab minority, there's a Shia Arab majority, and then there's the Kurds of the north, who are Sunni Muslims, but they're a different ethnic group. And the Kurds really got screwed by colonialism. They got split across 5 different countries: Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan. And so what we oftentimes don't think about is that when you have borders that go between these ethnic groups, you have borders going between families. And so now people can't even go visit their own families because they can't get permission to cross those borders, right? And so again, all of this was a strategy of divide and conquer, right? It's not on accident, right? It was all meant to diffuse power so that it was easier to influence and control from the outside. And then there's Saudi Arabia, which was just Arabia. But if you know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, you know that the British empowered a very marginal group in Arabia known as the House of Saud. And they empowered them to go fight the Ottomans, the Turks. And they didn't think they would win, but they ended up winning. And for the last 100 years, the holiest center of the Islamic world has been ruled by this particular group of people who have a relationship with a particular order of Islamic interpretation known as Wahhabism, which is a very literalist interpretation of Islam. And so many people say our holy scripture, the Quran, has many layers of meaning. Well, they take the most literal layer, right? So I would say compare it to very literalist evangelical Christianity, right? And so as a result of that, for the last 100 years, this group that has been very wealthy, right? They have Muslims coming from all over the world. Many of those countries have been colonized, so many of those people are poor, and they show up and you go there, and I've seen this myself, you get bombarded with pamphlets and translations of the Quran that's their translation of the Quran, and many people, they take these materials back and they're like, well, Islam started here, you probably know better than me. And then the Saudis also go and they build schools and they do all these different kinds of things to advocate for their interpretation of Islam. And so for the last 100 years, the heartbeat of the Muslim world has been influenced and impacted by this regime. And as you likely know, the United States has a very cozy relationship with the Saudi regime, primarily because of oil. So part of the reason why I bring this up is because we have to understand our relationship to things that have been happening in other places in the world, right? And that it's not just like, oh, look at them, but it's like, no, what have we been involved in as a country and as a government in relationship to these places? So with the Saudis, there was a group of people that were too extreme for the Saudis, and they went to Afghanistan to go fight the Russians in the 70s in Afghanistan. They're known as the Taliban. And who supported them? The United States supported them. And then, of course, that ended up backfiring in the United States because, as you know, the 9/11 attacks were launched from and organized from Afghanistan, right? And then that pulled us into a war. And then we know that there's been lots of tragedy that has been related to that, to the result of this last 20-year war, both for the United States as well as Afghanistan and many other people in the world. And so it's important for us to learn and understand our role in relationship to why things are the way they are in the world, and not just point your finger at other people and think that they're the bad people and so forth, and that it's just in a vacuum, right? So the history of Islam in America is also longer than people realize. There's emerging research on West African Muslim explorers that came to the Americas before Europeans did. But the first documented Muslim was a Moor from Spain, was brought by Spaniards as a slave to Florida. His name was Esteban. He was brought in 1527 AD. 20 to 25% of all enslaved Africans brought to British North America were Muslim. And 47.7% came from Muslim-ruled territories of Africa, in which Islam was part of the ethos and the culture and the society. And so we know that many enslaved Africans, subversively sought to maintain religion, culture, language, the church was a primary site of that because it was the one place in which enslaved people had some kind of autonomy and self-determination. And so historians have found churches that were oriented towards Mecca where they found secret compartments with prayer beads and prayer rugs inside. And on the Georgian and Sapelo Islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, there are islands in which Muslim slaves killed their slave masters and lived in autonomy into the early 20th century with Muslim names and echoes of Muslim cultures, West African cultures and traditions that was more held on relatively compared to the mainland because of the relative isolation. But as you move in the 20th century, you have the emergence of non-Orthodox forms of Islam in Black America. So Noble Drew Ali created something known as the Moorish Science Temple, but what's more known was what a man named Farad Muhammad taught Elijah Poole, who became Elijah Muhammad and started the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam was the most prominent figure of that organization was Malcolm X. And Malcolm X became a global figure, speaking out against racism in the United States, eventually went to Mecca, went to Africa, and through that process and experience, he ended up converting to Sunni Orthodox Islam. And with that, hundreds of thousands of African Americans converted to Islam. And prior to the 1970s, the vast majority of Muslims in the United States were African American. The only other group of significance that was notable were Arab Americans. And they went to places like Dearborn, Michigan, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and they were able to slide in Lebanese people, Syrian people. They were able to slide in on America's immigration policies that only allowed white people to come to the United States. So still to this day, Lebanese people, Syrian people, Arab Americans in general are expected to check Caucasian as their racial identity because of that legacy in our country. And so many of those Arab Americans were Christian, probably about half, but a lot of them were Muslims as well. And then in the 1960s, the immigration laws changed that allowed non-white people to immigrate legally to the United States. And with that, my family and many other families came from all over the world, and that's created this incredibly diverse American Muslim community. And we're contribute to society in all different kinds of ways. We're, artists, we're doctors, we're comedians, we're engineers, we're hip hop artists. We're the most famous Americans of all time. Muhammad Ali was Muslim. We have representation in Congress. The first Muslim congressperson was Keith Ellison, and his seat is now occupied by Representative Ilhan Omar. There's also Rashida Tlaib. And there's also another representative in Indiana named Andre Carson. And so, we're embedded into the society. We're part of this culture, part of this society, but yet we continue to be foreignized and otherized. And part of the reason why that occurs is the vast majority of us are non-white. And so it's relatively easy to foreignize and otherize us. And so a few years ago, Time magazine asked, is America Islamophobic? And I used to have an answer for this, but then somebody sent me this photo and I thought this answered it for me. This was a picture that was taken of a newsstand back then. These were actually next to each other. And the whole thing, some of you probably don't remember when there was all these accusations of President Obama being a secret Muslim. And the response was consistently, no, he's a Christian. He's a Christian. But what the response almost never was, so what if he was? Like, why would it be a problem if he was Muslim? Like, why is there this inherent suspicion with him if he somehow happens to be Muslim, right? But that's the suspicion that has always been around our community since 9/11, that there is something inherently suspicious about you and therefore un-American. You're not fully American. Your allegiances are not fully to American because you're Muslim or you're might be a secret Muslim, right? And so for myself, I grew up in Ohio, and life before 9/11 was very different. It was more like this invisibility. People used to ask me, especially white people, they used to ask me, like, what's a Muslim? And I'd be like, well, it's this thing that like billions of people, this religion that billions of people follow. Like a lot of people didn't know what it was. But some people thought they knew because there would be vandalism at our place of worship periodically. I was constantly being proselytized. Someone was always going to tell me I was going to go to hell if I didn't accept Jesus. I could just be standing at a bus stop and that would happen. And so my experience with most white folks was that, like, you know, oh, you don't eat pork, okay, you don't drink alcohol, you're not allowed to date, like that's weird. You know, there was a lot of like, that's weird, that's strange. Whereas my experience with African Americans was different. You know, like for most Black folks that I knew, it was like, well, you know, my uncle's Muslim. Like everybody had a Muslim uncle somewhere in their family, so there was this like relative acceptance, and I always appreciated that. It was really an important thing for me to feel that type of acceptance somewhere in the broader society beyond my own community. And in my community, like many communities, it would be a Black mosque, and then on a different part of town, there'd be an immigrant mosque, which is where my family went to. And that was something that always bothered me, that's kind of like, why are we divided? And that's something that, you know, since 9/11, there's been a lot of work to kind of create better relationships between these aspects of our community. But for those of us of these immigrant family backgrounds, it's this constant foreigner experience. It's like, you know, you get asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? And then it's like, you hardly have an accent. I'm like, well, this is how people in Ohio talk. I don't know what you're expecting me to sound like, you know. So it really calls into question, like, who do we include in who is American? But then 9/11 happened, and then there became this sudden focus on our community. And we started experiencing high levels of hate crimes, threats, harassments, government surveillance, investigations into individuals, into our communities. It felt like the government was kind of perpetuating the hate against us. And as Muslims, we were expected to apologize for 9/11, as if, you know, like we were supposed to apologize for something that happened to us. Like my brother lived in Manhattan on 9/11, and we couldn't reach them because the cell phone towers were down. We were scared for their safety. We didn't know what was going on. You know, so it's strange when the country suddenly focuses on you and your community and pits you as this other and this foreign threat. You know, when you've been born and lived in this country your whole life, it's a strange experience. And so as a community, we weren't very well prepared for that. We weren't particularly organized as a community. We weren't very political. You know, we just had like more social organizations and maybe religious organizations, but not really, we weren't that particularly organized. We weren't that effective at communicating. We did denounce as a community, but people kept saying, where are the Muslims? Because they weren't listening to us. And quite honestly, we're not represented in media very well. And so it's very rare to hear our voice in media. And so we went from this group that was relatively unknown to this group with all this suspicion around us. And then the Patriot Act got passed. And so that impacts the civil liberties of all Americans, because basically it means that the government can hold you indefinitely without access to a lawyer, without charging you with anything. And overwhelmingly, this is used against us. But it really suspends habeas corpus, legal, just due process and legal rights. Because if you're deemed an enemy combatant, which oftentimes if the suspicion comes around us, we are deemed an enemy combatant, all of a sudden you have no rights. And this would result in people just periodically disappearing from our community. This happened with a doctor in Dayton, Ohio, and near the community that I grew up in, who went to Canada to visit family and was held. Nobody knew where this person was for 3 months. Then the family was contacted, was held for another month after that, so 4 months. And you can imagine the kind of fear that leaves in our community, right? Knowing that you could just disappear at any time. So there was also widespread support for racial profiling of our community. That was a mainstream thought in America, that like, yeah, of course we should profile, even though it was overwhelmingly demonstrated and proven that profiling was ineffective, right? That it was not effective at getting at actual terrorists or actual criminals, right? And so there was this kind of widespread support for discrimination against us. And then for me, it's my worst experiences. I've had lots of different racial profiling experiences over the last 20 years, but my worst experiences have been when I've tried to come back in the country from somewhere. And because customs became Homeland Security. And so it wasn't just about checking plants or making sure you weren't bringing currency into the country anymore. It was like, security process. And for me, I would get pulled out, I'd get taken into another room, I'd get interrogated, I'd get yelled at. These were very challenging, frustrating experiences, especially knowing that I had no rights in that situation, that if they could do anything to me, I could end up in Guantanamo. So I better shut up and be quiet and just hope for the best and hope this works out, because I don't know what they're going to do. These are very precarious situations you find yourself in. And for me, as a person who lived in Michigan for 7 years, which is where I met Dr. Kamimura Jimenez, you know, he knows, like, people go to Canada all the time. People cross the border, they go to Toronto, they go to Windsor. I just stopped doing it because it just wasn't worth it for me anymore. I didn't even, and so, you know, I had these various experiences over many, many years. Every man in my family has been on a flight watch list at some point. Including my brother's children. From the time they were 6 years old, they were on a flight watch list. They went to the airport the day of a flight. They weren't going to fly because they would be held, and their IDs would be taken in the back, and they'd have to get them cleared the day before if they were going to try to fly somewhere. So it created issues in our lives. I've shared with you a few stories. I'm not going to spend too much time telling more stories about my experiences or my family's experiences. But some years ago, there was an attempt to create this, what got labeled in the media as a Ground Zero mosque in New York City, which was not a ground zero, and it was not a mosque. It was a Islamic community recreation center that was modeled off the Jewish Community Center of New York, which was modeled off the YMCA. So people in this country went buck wild crazy over a Muslim YMCA. And it was not hallowed ground. I had been there before. It used to be a Burlington coat factory. Like, it was not special. You know, because it was in Lower Manhattan, there was all this opposition. More than half of Democrats were against it. The Anti-Defamation League came out against it. So Islamophobia is not a partisan issue. Some people think it is. It is widespread in our society, and it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily align purely with the political right-left politics of the United States. There's also been, since 9/11, just ongoing violence and attacks on our places of worship, creating a lot of fear in our there's been arsons, there's been, you know, we've been targets, and we've been targets of the government. There's been congressional hearings saying entitled "The Extent of Radicalization in the American Muslim Community and that Community's Response." And you should know, as a demographic, American Muslims commit less crime than any demographic in the country, by far. It's not even close. It's a little weird how little crime we do, right? But yet there's been this fixation on us. And so during these hearings, then Congressman Keith Ellison gave emotional testimony about Salman Hamdani, who was an EMT who went into the towers to save people's lives and died on 9/11. He was one of hundreds of Muslims that died on 9/11. But we don't hear those stories. A lot of Muslims live in that part of New York City. And so again, it's a convenient narrative to erase us from the story of America, from the story and the trauma of 9/11, to advance a framing and a portrayal of us as foreign and other and not American. You know, some years ago, there was a man named Pastor Terry Jones who did this thing called Burn a Quran Day. So we have these profiteers. This man would continue to show up in Michigan, where I lived. He would protest outside of predominantly Arab American high schools and say that there were terrorists inside to get media attention. But the worst of the profiteers, I think, is Pamela Geller. And look at the subway signs she used to put up in New York. In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man. Where does that language come from, right? And so some of the language that's used, it harkens back to very old tropes and language that go really far back, and they have this resonance amongst many people. You should also know that the NYPD for almost 15 years had a surveillance program of every Muslim student association, of every Muslim place of worship, and many Muslim-owned businesses throughout the entire northeast seaboard of the United States, which just calls into question, what is the jurisdiction of a police department? But then also, they violated civil liberties and laws, spent millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars on this. Do you know how many leads they came up with in the life of that program? 0, not one. So talk about a colossal waste of taxpayer dollars, time, energy, resources, you name it, and in the process undermining our civil liberties, civil rights. You may remember, some of you probably do, some of you might remember the story of Ahmed, the 13-year-old boy that brought a clock to school. And his teacher thought it was a bomb, took it to the administration, and then he was arrested. So this became national news. President Obama was the president at the time, and he declared, no, this is the kind of kid we actually want, someone who's interested in science, mathematics, and so forth. And then some people kind of thought it became this feel-good story. But when the cameras went away, his family received so many death threats, they ended up leaving the country. And so they don't live in the United States anymore. And so again, but really he's a symbol for the kind of bullying and violence and treatment that Muslim children have experienced in this country for many, many years, that is ongoing. Islamophobia doesn't just impact people who identify with the religion of Islam. The community that has been impacted by violence from Islamophobia in the greatest proportion in relationship to their population is the American Sikh community, which is a different faith tradition that originates from northern India. And as part of the tradition, the men do not cut their hair and keep their hair in turbans and have beards. Well, Islamophobes don't know the difference. And as a result, they can conduct violence towards them, including in 2012, a mass murder at the Gurdwara Temple in Wisconsin, in which this person, who we don't call a terrorist, we call this person a crazy individual, right? So we individualize this man, but then we collectivize the person who is supposedly the terrorist. So we've racialized what the terrorist is, right? And then we individualize the white gunman, right? And this person went in and murdered people while they were praying in their place of worship. And I also want to know that in our environment of mass shootings that we've had in our country, we all know Virginia Tech, Newtown, Tucson, Aurora, list goes, Las Vegas, list goes on and on, sadly. We never include this one. This was the only one of those mass shootings during the Obama years that President Obama didn't show up. And what I understood was that politically they thought they were concerned about the optics of what it would look like. And with all that narrative that he's a secret Muslim and that he's empathizing with these brown people with turbans and so forth. So that we didn't mourn this loss in the same way. And I believe that that's because we don't actually mourn this loss of life the same way we do other communities. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge and recognize that. Hindu Americans have also been subjected to hate. My former student at University of Michigan, Nina Davalori, was the first South Asian winner of Miss America, and she got bombarded with hateful tweets when she won. This is Miss America, not Miss Terrorist, hashtag get off the screen. Are you serious? The Arab win? So Indian American, Arab, doesn't matter, brown, just throw them all together. But you may say, okay, well, these are just tweets. Okay, well, Hindu Americans have actually increasingly been subject to violence. Again, perceived as Muslims. For whatever reason, there's been an increase in the amount of Hindus that have been subject to Islamophobia and violence. And that included in Kansas City a few years ago, where this individual at a bar decided to suddenly shoot these two individuals. And then, it's been embedded into our politics. And if those of you who remember the 2016 election, we were very much at the center of the political issues, including the advocacy of a Muslim ban, a banning of Muslims from entering this country. This happened in the United States. Somebody ran on this, won, and then enacted that. That happened. our media continued to propagate. If you look at that, it says, is Islam a destructive voice? Throughout the world, there are about 1.6 billion Muslims, and 35 countries practice some kind of Sharia law. Now, that's meant to instill fear of all Muslims, right? Because Sharia is bad, right? But the thing is that what they want you to believe is that whatever Saudi Arabia does is what Sharia is, right? But Sharia has lots of different, shows up in lots of different ways. It's very different in Malaysia than it is in Saudi Arabia, and so. But this is a way of creating the sense of like, oh, they're all bad. Like you shouldn't give any of them the benefit of the doubt. And then we also have liberal Islamophobes like Bill Maher, who uses this show of 4 to 5 million viewers to advocate Islamophobia as well. I don't have time to go into the amount of times this man has perpetuated Islamophobia in a consistent manner. During that election, Khizr and Ghazala Khan stood up on behalf of their son who died in service of this country. But they are a Gold Star family, and he's a lawyer, Khizr Khan, and he's held his constitution in the air to stand up and say this idea of banning Muslims is un-American, is unconstitutional. It is in conflict with what we understand to be basic American values. And they bravely stood up. But sadly, the Muslim ban happened. And if you look at the countries in which this ban was enacted, not one national from any of these countries has ever committed a terrorist death in the United States. Not one. You know which countries have? Saudi Arabia and Egypt. But yet somehow just not included on that list. Why do you think that might be? Was this about keeping Americans safe, or was this just about advancing a narrative around Muslims, and while not upsetting our allies that we enable? And so during that time, many progressives said, you know, oh, like if they're going to have a Muslim registry, then, you know, I'm going to sign up on that list to make that list make no sense, like so that they don't know who the Muslims are. Newsflash: you don't sign up to be on the list. We get signed up onto it, which is how we get profiled and how we get stopped, and you know. So it's called the National Security Entry Exit Registry System. This what got once again enacted during the last Trump administration. But this has been kind of, it periodically grows, and then it kind of shrinks under Obama. They eventually eliminated it, but the Trump administration brought it back, and to be honest, I don't know where the state of that is right now. I mentioned to you that we're not very well represented in media. For a while, we had somebody named Hassan Minhaj with his show Patriot Act that had a platform and a voice, and who really started to finally bring some of the voices from our community forward, including some of our critiques of Saudi Arabia. Surprise, surprise, American Muslims oftentimes have criticisms of the Saudi regime. But, you know, and so this episode he did about Saudi Arabia was actually banned in Saudi Arabia and made a lot of news. But the thing is that, you know, we just didn't have visual representation. We didn't have our voices usually in media. We had a lot of people talking about us and very few examples of us talking about ourselves and about our own experiences, our communities, our lives, our realities. You know, I mentioned that we have Congress people representation. But also the ways in which we get terrorized, those things don't show up in media. So, you know, so actually Ilhan Omar's mosque, before she became a representative, was bombed. Didn't make any national news. Like, these things happen all the time to our community, you know. But if a Muslim does something, it's wall-to-wall coverage, right? And the contrast of that to what happened when Muslims got attacked in New Zealand is striking, right? The kind of solidarity, the kind of support, the kind of sense of loss and community that happened in New Zealand. The haka was done by the Maori people in solidarity with this horrific murder that happened in New Zealand, right? I can't imagine, quite honestly, I just can't imagine something like that happening in the same kind of solidarity with our community in this country, with the same kind of national outpouring of support. Maybe I'm cynical, maybe I don't think that, but I feel like I have too many examples to think differently at this point. And so there's been a rise in recent years of anti-Muslim hate and targeting, especially during the run up to the 2016 election and the years that followed. And so as I wrap up and we move to Q&A, we are not the only community that's subject to challenges in this society. But I want to leave you with a famous quote from World War II, which is said, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up. And so our community needs allies. We need a dialogue. We need relationships. We need people to understand the things that we've experienced and that we navigate. We need to be included in the conversations around race and racism and the ways we experience that in our communities. And so I'm looking forward to the Q&A and the conversation going forward. Here's some resources. I'll keep this on the screen for a few moments as we kind of begin our Q&A.
Thank you, Amer. This is really informative and helpful, I think, for framing up so much of what our communities deal with, and that it's not like an incident that may have happened in this moment. It's the lead up to these incidents that we deal with, and how we've kind of framed how some incidents have been framed up for us, and that our responses therefore become kind of fractured because of those inaccurate assumptions of who we are. So I think there's a couple things that, and we're getting a couple questions in here, and one is we think about how people are othered because of so many of the other things that we are. This comment is really about humanity, but that in humanity we use all the aspects of who we are to create an otherness, to kind of fracture us further. And so is there an approach that leaders should take in terms of, when we look at college campuses and we look at affinity groups, we also do create these spaces in which we kind of do create an other space in an effort to create belonging, actually. And so what are some of, it's kind of an oppositional approach to something that we're trying to actually combat.
Yeah, and this from our time at Michigan. I'm a big believer of the both and not the either or. I think dualism is our enemy in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. The us versus them, the either or, the binary thinking is really dangerous. And so we need the both and the both and as related to your question, is that we need to be able to have spaces where we can be in community and a sense of belonging with people we identify with and relate to, and a sense of validation and support around our shared identities. And we need to be able to engage and have dialogue and build relationships and build understanding and potentially build solidarity as we begin to understand what's similar and different around what we experience. And then how do we create that opportunity? And I think one of the things that I'm concerned about in the way we talk about social justice is that we don't always talk about the solidarity building and the need to build power as related to that. as opposed to kind of sometimes perpetuating a hierarchy of oppression. And it doesn't mean that there isn't incredibly important things that we have to learn about what's happened in this country, specifically to Black and Native people, but it's also important for us to understand that building power and building solidarity to confront and challenge systems of oppression and white supremacy, it requires us to engage, to dialogue, to learn, and to be willing and open to get uncomfortable, to be vulnerable, which is hard when you've been marginalized. It's very difficult to do that. There may be trauma that you've experienced, so there's a lot of need for healing. But as we engage in the healing in some of our affinity spaces, we can't just stay in that space forever, because it doesn't prepare us to step into the world and create change the way that we need to, because we don't build power that way. And the only way we build power is by coming together and building alliances, which is where the word ally comes from. I think a lot of people, they poo-poo the word ally now, but the word ally comes from alliances, right? Which is about building power. And so for me, I think it's really important that we understand that. I've always done my work to try to do the best I can to learn about the experiences and realities of other communities. And what I realized over time when I was in my work, because there was so few people in my background in my field, was that a lot of people weren't learning about what I was experiencing and what my community was experiencing. And it took me a long time to really find my voice and realize, like, no, I need to be able to share what I've experienced, because I was always like, no, well, we don't experience what some other communities experience. So, and in the process, our experience just further got invisibilized. And that was when I realized, and then when I started to, honestly, I never wanted to do this topic. I never wanted to present on this topic as a diversity professional. And you know this, Mark, but I got really pushed to do it because there were so few people in my background. And then once I did it and I saw so many people that I knew that were very well informed on lots of other issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, oftentimes knew nothing about this topic. And that really disturbed me. And that may cause me to realize, like, wow, like, we have very far to go for my community to find any space in this conversation to address what we're dealing with. And the last thing I'll say is related to this is that there's an important case study in New York City in which the communities that were subject to Islamophobia from that profiling program that was happening in New York City, they built a coalition with Black and Latinx communities in New York City that were being targeted by stop and frisk. And our communities were being subject to stop and frisk too. And so through that process, there was a coalition built, and that led to the ending of both of those programs in New York City, the ending of stop and frisk and the ending of the Islamophobia racial profiling surveillance program. And so, there are concrete realities that come with building solidarity. It's hard work, but it's worth it for the purpose of creating meaningful change.
Yeah, I mean, I think you highlighted there's a couple of questions in here, and I think that you started to really kind of started to give us a peek at some of the realities of challenges that we're faced with. And, I want to kind of ask this question. And there was, this past week, we dealt with an incident on our campus, and as this attendee has stated, that we failed to deal with Islamophobia on our campus, and to a certain degree, felt like we further exaggerated it. And so, the fact that this is a topic that I feel like has challenged our institution. So the questions there's two questions here. What does allyship for Muslims look like from a billion-dollar institution? We often look at endowments as representations of power and power for transformation. So what does that look like in terms of using our resources to address allyship within our Muslim community? But then also, what are some tangible actions that, centers like mine, like the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, should do to support Muslim students?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, if I go back to our time in Michigan, one of the things that we did is that we always said that we're going to support communities however they show up. And even if we don't know everything, even if we don't understand everything, as people who work on diversity, equity, inclusion on our campuses, it is our responsibility to learn and understand who our students are, how do they want to be supported in a way that's meaningful to them, to help them feel a greater sense of belonging on our campus. And then with that trust building that we build through that process, with the learning, with the ability to be able to identify, okay, what are your needs that we need to meet, and understand what are your concerns, what are your anxieties, what are your frustrations. Through that process, building the trust to, first of all, deliver, especially with an institution with resources, right? Deliver the things that will alleviate that. Most communities are not looking for everything to be oriented around them all the time. That's not my experience in the Muslim community. And then I think the next piece is that bridge building, right? How do we create the spaces for meaningful dialogue for us to be able to understand one another better? Because I think right now we think a lot of social justice work is being right. And it's what Dr. Jamie Washington calls the woke Olympics. And the reality is that we all have something to learn, all of us. We all experience marginality and we all have privilege at the same time around different aspects of ourselves and of our identity. And the thing is that the only way you're going to be willing to do that is if you're willing to be uncomfortable about the ways in which you benefit, right? And so for me, that's as a man, as an able-bodied individual, as a heterosexual, I have class privilege. There's all different kinds of ways in which we benefit. And if we're not willing to look at that, right? And but we only care about the thing that we're impacted by, right? Then it becomes difficult to show people that there's a mutual learning that has to happen for us to build these alliances, right? And then that's how we build the trust, is when we're able to demonstrate and show each other that we're willing to get uncomfortable, to be willing to learn and understand each other better. Like Mark and I, we're different backgrounds. We've learned a lot from one another, right? And that, I mean, first of all, I think for me, and I think for you, it makes life more fruitful and more interesting and more more expansive in so many different kinds of ways. But even if that's not what motivates you, even if you're just more comfortable being with people like yourself, understanding that it's still in your self-interest, right? Because if you care about the liberation of your own people or the empowerment of your own people, you build power through learning and understanding what's similar and different about your experiences from other communities. And when you, especially around the things that are similar, when you start to realize like, oh, wow, we both deal with X, Y, and Z, that's part of how that solidarity work in New York City ended up occurring. They both realized they were being subject to certain kinds of policies. They were being targeted, and they were stronger if they came together, and they could build more power to be able to create change. So a university like WashU, when different communities come together and say, hey, we want the university to do X, Y, and Z differently, if it's just one community saying that versus 4 or 5 who are saying, we all experience X, Y, and Z. And then we also, for the things that maybe all of our communities don't experience, we also stand with the other group for the thing that they experience, right? And we want to, and then we want to be in dialogue with our leadership around what are we going to do as WashU differently, right? What are we going to do as related to the surrounding community in St. Louis? What are we going to do in relationship to the Bosnian community in St. Louis? Didn't think I knew that, did you? So what are these relationships, right? What are we doing with this opportunity? Is it just simply to have a big endowment and be great and tell ourselves how great we are? Or are we actually trying to move the needle in meaningful way and show our students that we can create meaningful change, that the opportunity of higher education is to position ourselves to be able to enact meaningful and transformative change in the world? So how do we do it on campus? How do we do it in the community? How do we do it in the world? And then how do we use this experience and this opportunity to prepare us to have the tools to go enact that wherever we're going to go next?
Thank you. You talked about like being uncomfortable, getting some into dialogue, and I know that so many times, especially over this past year, our communities of color have been really pushed to, pushed to the limits in terms of their ability to kind of be uncomfortable. It's almost as if we've been uncomfortable every day, like in a more heightened way. And so when these moments happen, where particular communities are being targeted, that how do you see allyship play itself out, or how do you see institutional resources, but like institutional players kind of create spaces that don't come at the cost of our students or of the communities being targeted?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the student's responsibility to make the institution more inclusive. It's ours. And those of us who work at the university, the burden is not on the students. It should not be on the students' back. However, it is important for us to have relationships, listen, learn, understand what students' needs are, and try to problem solve. How can we enact change, right? And I think for those of us who are not at the senior level at the university, we find ourselves sometimes in these in-between situations, because sometimes our senior leaders are very disconnected from those on-the-ground realities of our students, right? And so it still goes back to leadership, right? And this is something that I really want our students to really think about, is that we are operating within a Eurocentric patriarchal system. It's hierarchical, and the academy is that, right? So how do we disrupt that? We disrupt that by modeling something different, right? And so we should be looking for leadership that is bringing people in, that is listening, that is responsive, right? That is centered on broad needs and broad community realities, and not just a certain narrow focus of what is the preconceived notion of what higher education supposedly is about, right? And so it's through leadership that we can kind of open that up. I talk a lot about intercultural leadership, right? And this kind of decentralizing leadership, that everybody's a leader in their role. And do you have people in positions in the more senior positions of the institution that get that, they understand the interdependence of everybody involved, the students, the janitorial staff, the frontline workers, all of us, right? And how do we create the pathways and the opportunities for those voices to actually shape who we're becoming as an institution? Or is it simply that we think we know better and we're going to do whatever we're going to do regardless of what you think and no matter how you feel? And that's really the way the system was designed to operate, right? And if you get really honest, these institutions were not created for us. Not, if you looked at them not that long ago, some decades ago, these institutions were for not just white men, they were for elite white men. Wealthy, they were not like regular white men couldn't go to these institutions, right? Women obviously couldn't go to these institutions. Certainly people of color couldn't go to these institutions, right? And so it requires an active interruption, an active understanding of the way that system works, and an active effort to operate differently. But the one thing that I will say is that um, we have to also find a way to model how we're trying to live in the world, how we're trying to align ourselves, and not just tear people down in the process, right? Not just portray others as the enemy, just because people don't know or understand what they may be perpetuating, right? So how do we have that conversation to help folks understand? And I know if people feel like, well, it's not my burden, it shouldn't be my responsibility. And maybe you're right. For some people it isn't, but for people like myself and for Mark who've signed up to be educators, to work in these institutions, it is our responsibility, right? It is our responsibility to have those conversations and to bring the voices of the students to our senior leaders and to say, and to be very clear, this is what our students are articulating that they need to be able to make this a safe and holistic experience. And then you have to learn the business case. You have to be able to learn the self-interest, right? What's in WashU's interest? Is it in WashU's interest to have a black eye around with certain communities because certain things occur that don't seem very supportive? What's the likelihood of other people wanting to go to that community if they see that versus them being perceived and the word of mouth being, no, that's the place you want to be, right? Because you get supported and this and that or whatever. There's a self-interest involved there. So you also have to learn that. You can't just expect everybody to do things just because it's the right thing. I wish we lived in that world. But you also have to learn how to actually maneuver strategically and get people, even if they don't agree with you, even if they don't, even if they're never going to fully understand, to see the self-interest, to be able to see why advocating or being responsive in their leadership is in their own interest too.
So you have just a few minutes left, and there's one question request for recommended readings besides the ones you had on your slide for white Americans to understand the diversity of religious and cultural groups that have been misidentified and marginalized in the U.S. So I don't know if there's I know there's a big category there. There's a lot of books too, but is there a reading that you kind of lean towards?
Oh boy, that is such a broad question. I mean, wow, gosh, that is. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking about something. Yeah, I'm not thinking of something. I mean, like my mind goes. My mind went to the autobiography of Malcolm X, but that's not. I don't think that answers the question. And then I will say that there's an organization called Convergence that talks about the interrelationship between religious and spiritual and secular identity in relationship to diversity and inclusion, because oftentimes that gets segmented out. And what I hope that you got from my talk is that you can't extract one from the other, because the Islamophobia was not just an issue of religion, but it's also an issue of racism. And so like what I often say is that I don't have the luxury of looking at religion as separate from race, because I experience it at the intersection, and because I'm treated and at that intersection. So, so it's important for us to not just segment things and think that they have nothing to do with one another. They have everything to do with one another.
I was going to say, I typically have to look at a library of books to put on a shelf to answer that question. So
this is what happens when you get a doctorate. You read 10 different books on one, and then.
So we're at time. I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and really, I think, providing us with some thoughtful considerations as we move forward and as our community aims to strengthen our relationship and our support of not just our Muslim students, but all students who are impacted by Islamophobia and its many forms, and how I think you did a great job of really exposing that, and how so many people, who are not, that last slide, who may not be understand that they are also being impacted by Islamophobia, even though they may be
Yeah,
watching it.
those civil liberties
So,
have been undermined for all Americans, for sure. And used against us primarily, but it undermines the rights of everyone. Very good point.
so thank you so much. I I do want to say that it does. I wish we could just walk across the street and you know, of course, in this time masked and then give each other a hug. But you know, at the same time, you know, it's good to see you again and to catch up on this journey that we are both on to serve our campus communities and hopefully create another generation who will improve the experiences that we had on our own campuses. So thank you so
Absolutely.
much. And thank you all for coming and joining and being part of this conversation. We hope that you will continue to visit the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. If you are on campus, if you're off campus, we do have several events that are listed on our social media pages. You can find us at Woostel CDI on Instagram. And we look forward to seeing you either in person or virtually sometime soon. Thank you all very much and have a great evening.